Okay, today is going to be our sixth day of notes for our ancient Greece unit. And today we're going to cover the important people of Greece. And this is probably going to be one of our longer PowerPoints of the year. We're going to start out with the three greatest philosophers of ancient Greece. Those would be Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And you will need to know the order that they come in. You've got Socrates first, then Plato, then Aristotle. I remember it by SPA, S-P-A, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Before we can talk about our three philosophers, we need to know what a philosopher is. A philosopher was a Greek thinker who denied that the events that happened in the world were caused by the whims of the gods. They said that they could use observation and reason to explain why things would happen. And in some cases, they might even deny that the gods existed. The word philosopher means lover of wisdom. They wanted to educate themselves and learn as much as they could. The type of philosophers that we're going to talk about are the Socratic philosophers because they follow the model of Socrates. There were other types of philosophers like Stoics and Epicureans, but we're not going to get into them today. Socrates lectured as a tutor and was paid by the families of his students. It is said that he never wrote down a single word, and what we know about him was passed on to us by his students Plato and Aristotle. Socrates was famous for his Socratic method, and you guys might have participated in a Socratic seminar in school. But the Socratic method is a question and answer approach to examine moral concepts, real big ideas like what is good, what is justice, what is beauty. And he thought that each of these big ideas were like an onion, and you could peel them back and try to get to the absolute truth of this concept. Take an idea like, is it okay to steal? In the eyes of Socrates, you would try to ask that question and go through all the different arguments to try to get to the absolute truth. Yes, it's okay to steal, or no, it's not okay to steal. So this was an absolute idea when it comes to these philosophical questions. Socrates would be regarded as the father of political and moral philosophy, what we know as ethics, right or wrongs in a society. Socrates was highly critical of the Greek gods and popular religious beliefs of the time. We think that he denied the gods existed, and he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens. He went on trial and was found guilty and was executed in Athens in 399 BCE. His form of execution was that he had to drink the juice from the hemlock plant. The hemlock plant was poisonous and it would slowly make your body go numb. And eventually your heart would stop. So that's how he died. Next up we have Plato, not Play-Doh like in the picture. He was the student of Socrates. So as we said, Plato was both a student and friend to Socrates. Plato had fought in the Peloponnesian Wars. After Socrates was executed, he thought it was in his best interest to leave too, so the same thing didn't happen to him. And he traveled to see Egypt, Italy, and Sicily. He would eventually return to Athens, and he establishes the Academy in 387 BCE. And the Academy was a school dedicated to the instruction of philosophy and science. And we use that word academy all the time when we talk about different schools. So here we have Plato's Academy, and we've got Plato in the center with his students surrounding him, debating philosophical questions. Most of our knowledge of Socrates comes from Plato. Plato wrote 30 dialogues, that's where you have two people talking, on a wide range of topics in the form of conversations with Socrates. So he might ask Socrates a question in these dialogues, and he would write as if Socrates was still alive and answering the question. His best known work was called The Republic. It was his vision of a perfectly governed society, but it was not a democracy, which is what Athens was known for. It was actually rule with an enlightened despot. One man who considered himself to be both a philosopher and king would rule the people, and he thought that was the best way to rule. He's also known for saying, "Know thyself." You can't know about anything else until you know yourself. We have Aristotle next. He was a student of Plato at the Academy, and then he would go on to teach at the Academy for 20 years. We talked about him last class as he had tutored Alexander the Great, and he had a huge impact on Alexander. As Alexander created his empire, when he conquered new lands, he brought the ideas of Aristotle and the Greeks with him and encouraged the people that he had conquered to take up these ideas. So we see cultural diffusion, and Aristotle was a huge part of why that happened. And we end up getting Hellenistic culture out of Aristotle's vision that Alexander would go on to teach the people that he had conquered. Aristotle founded the Lyceum, where topics such as politics, ethics, biology, logic, literature, and physics were taught. He wanted his students to be well-rounded. We see that today in Western civilization. That's the way our university studies and colleges are based upon. So we'll see this happen about 1,500 years later in Europe when they hit a renaissance and start looking back at how the Greeks ran their schools and universities. And they will follow this method. Next up are the Greek playwrights. They write plays. Here we have a theater. And since we don't have television or the internet or video games, if you want to be entertained, you go to watch the plays. First up, we have Aeschylus, who writes tragedy, which are serious plays about love, hate, and betrayal. The greatest contribution he makes to theater is adding a second actor to plays. Before him, all the action took place between a single actor and the Greek chorus. And this chorus would act as the narrator of the play, driving the story along, and they would interact with the actor. He would go on to write 90 plays. We only have 7. Okay, we know that he wrote 90 because we have a list of the plays that he wrote, but we only have the written documents of 7. Next up is Sophocles, who writes tragedy. He wrote over 123 plays, but we only have 7. Those include Oedipus, Antigone, and Ajax. His most famous story is Oedipus, which is about the main character who is sent away by his parents and eventually kills his father on his way back home, marries his mother not knowing that it's actually his mother, has children with her. That's why we have the little joke, "How I Met Your Mother," which happens to be his mother. And that goes back to the overall themes that Sophocles looked at in his plays. Fate. Okay, he was sent away by his parents because fate said he would kill his father and marry his mother. He felt so guilty about it that he stabbed his eyes with needles and ran away from his hometown mad. And it also incorporates divine and human justice. His parents had upset the gods, and this was the revenge that the gods would have on the people. He also added a third actor to the Greek theater, so more people interacting on stage. Another playwright who wrote tragedy was Euripides. So time will reveal everything. It is a babbler and speaks even when not asked. And whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad, which we saw in one of his fellow playwright stories, Oedipus, that we just talked about. Wasn't enough to kill off Oedipus, they make him go crazy. Euripides would go on to write 90 works with strong women characters as well as smart slaves, and he used satire. he poked fun at the heroes of Greek mythology, along with Greek popular culture of the time. The women and slaves would always try to talk sense into the aristocratic husband, and he would never listen. And at the end of the story, it was always like, yeah, I told you so, but you didn't listen. We have Aristophanes next. He does not write tragedy, he actually writes comedy. Comedy is lighthearted, humorous, and usually has a happy ending. He writes 40 plays, and 11 of them survive, including The Clouds, The Frogs, and Lysistrata. Lysistrata was an anti-war play that was written during the time of the Peloponnesian War. He did not think it was a good idea for the Greeks to be fighting amongst themselves. The next group that we're going to talk about are poets, sculptors, and historians. Homer is our blind poet, or bard, who's credited with creating the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad was based on the Trojan War, and the Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus' journey home after the war. We don't know if Homer actually existed, but he is the one given credit for these epic poems. And these poems tell much of the history of the early Greeks, the Mycenaeans, and our first accounts of the Trojan War. Next, we have Phidias, who was a sculptor and an architect. Phidias would supervise the construction of the Parthenon. He acted as an architect. He would create the statue of Athena that was within the Parthenon. He also sculpted the Zeus at Mount Olympus, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which we no longer have with us anymore. The Great Pyramids are the only ones that survive. He also created the Elgin marbles, which are on the bottom of this slide. On the left, we think that's what his sculpture of Athena would have looked like. The top right, we've got the Parthenon, which was on the Acropolis in Athens. And the lower right, we've got the statue of Zeus, which would have been found in the temple at Olympus. We have our first historian, Herodotus, who's considered the father of history. He wrote about the Persian Wars. His book was called The Histories and was a collection of stories about different places and people he had learned about on his travels. And it, of course, included the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians. The word history means inquiry in Greek. If you are going to make an inquiry, you are asking questions. But it has come to mean what we call history today. Now, the histories written by Herodotus were attacked in the ancient world for bias and some inaccuracies. It seemed like Herodotus always tried to make the Greeks look better than what they actually were. Such as in the stories of the Persian Wars, he made it seem like there were many, many, many more Persian troops than there actually were, and that the Greeks killed more than they actually did. Our next historian is Thucydides, and he wrote the histories of the Peloponnesian War. He had fought on the side of Athens. But he is considered the first true objective historian, meaning he tried to take the bias out of his works. His research and writings looked at both sides of the conflict, his side of Athens, but he would also interview people who fought on the side of Sparta to try to get the most absolute truth that he could. And he is known for saying history repeats itself, and if you look at world events, it definitely seems that this does happen. The next group we're going to talk about are scientists and mathematicians. We have Hippocrates, not Hippocrates. Hippocrates was a physician or doctor and regarded as one of the most outstanding figures in medicine of all time. He's going to reject superstition and magic of primitive medicine. And instead, he thinks that medicine should be a branch of science. Okay, using observation and experimentation, he thinks that he can find the answers to different ailments that afflict people. He recommended that physicians record their findings and methods and work together to help each other solve these medical questions. Physicians today still take what is called the Hippocratic Oath, in which certain ethical guidelines are laid out. We think that Hippocrates wrote it, but we're not 100% sure. But it pretty much means that you want to keep the best interest of your patient the top priority. Archimedes was a Greek mathematician, physicist, engineer, astronomer, and philosopher. He had a lot going on. He's attributed with discovering the principles of density, why some things seem heavier than others based on their mass, and buoyancy, why some things float and some things sink. He also discovered the value of pi, which since graduating high school, I really haven't needed it. He creates several inventions, like creating a screw to raise the water level to bring water up to a higher elevation. We think he came up with a claw that could pick up enemy ships, kind of like a crane, and the burning mirror, where if you focus the rays of the sun on one point using mirrors, you could set it on fire. Mythbusters would go on to do an episode on the burning mirror, and it turned out it did not work. They were using bronze instead of the glass that we use today. And of course, boats would not stay steady enough for this pinpoint ray of light to eventually get hot enough to catch it on fire. So that myth was busted. You've all heard of Pythagoras before. He was a mathematician. He's known as the father of numbers and believed that numbers constitute the true nature of things. If that's true, then I really don't know anything because I'm not good with numbers. He's the first to associate musical notes with numerical ratios, which creates the musical scale, something else I'm not very good with. But the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, is important if you want to make a rectangular garden with all 90-degree angles, or you're trying to line up a soccer field. It comes in handy. So there you go. One thing that math is useful for even after you graduate. We've got Euclid, who's considered the father of geometry. And he is definitely not as bad as the guy who creates algebra. We'll get to him much later this year. We don't like him either. He writes Elements, which is the basis for modern geometry. So if you're taking algebra this year, next year you'll probably take geometry and get to learn about Euclid's works. In astronomy, we have Aristarchus, who says the Earth and planets revolve around the sun. And that's actually how it works, but no one follows this idea. Instead, in the Hellenistic world, people followed Ptolemy, who said the Earth is the center of the solar system. We call that the geocentric theory. And people are going to follow this idea for the next 14 centuries, including the Roman Catholic Church. You'll learn more about the astronomers who went against the church to try to prove this theory wrong next year in World History 2. The last group that we're going to talk about are Greek statesmen and kings, so the leaders of Greece. We have Themistocles, who's an Athenian leader during the Persian Wars, and he advised Athens to build up their navy. And the superior navy was the key to defeating the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. By breaking the Persian navy, the Persians could not keep their troops fed and supplied, and eventually the Greeks would come out on top. We also have King Leonidas of Sparta, who fought and died with his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BCE, fighting the Persians under King Xerxes. When the Persians told the Spartans to hand over their weapons. The Persians said, "You want them? Come and get them." The Persians attacked the smaller Spartan force, and eventually the Spartans were all killed. But their sacrifice gave the rest of the Greeks time to prepare and defeat the Persian soldiers under Xerxes, helping them win the Persian Wars. We did have one more person who we didn't add to the PowerPoint, and that's going to be Pericles. We talked about him not too long ago. Remember, he was the leader of Athens during the Golden Age. So we just went over him, but don't forget about him. He tried to extend democracy in Athens and protect this new Athenian empire that was created by using the Delian League as a source for funding. So don't forget about Pericles either. And that's going to be it for notes for our unit on Greece. So we'll review next class to get ready for our test.